Mark had always been a man of keen observation, a skill honed over peaceful days and long nights as a doorman at a high-end corporate building. Each floor of that building was occupied by prestigious companies, but none commanded as much respect as the one owned by Leonard Vance. The top floor, with its glass facade and lights that never dimmed, was the heart of LV Tech, the Millionaires company. Mark knew Leonard wasn't just a name in the building. He was the reason half the offices existed, as his influence drew clients and partners alike. Leonard had a habit of crossing the lobby at unpredictable hours, always flanked by assistants carrying confidential documents. Despite his calm demeanor and flawless suits, he seemed to carry the weight of an invisible world. Mark noticed the details: the hurried phone calls, the watchful eyes of his security team, and especially the constant flurry of attorneys and executives around the Millionaire. Leonard wasn't just powerful. He was a target of many interests. One rainy night, fate intervened. Mark was about to end his shift when he heard voices in the underground garage. That area was restricted, and any unusual activity was cause for concern. Driven by curiosity and a nagging intuition, he quietly descended the stairs. Hidden behind a column, he managed to catch part of the conversation. "Leonard thinks he's untouchable. Little does he know we've got the codes," said a deep voice. Leonard's name rang in Mark's mind like an alarm. There was no doubt about it. Leonard Vance was the target. Mark immediately recognized the implication. The codes had to be related to LV Tech. He'd overheard enough in passing to know the company was renowned for its cutting-edge innovations and highly secure internal systems. The next sentence confirmed his fears. "Once we leak the information, that glass tower is coming down," the other conspirator said. Mark didn't need to hear more. Leonard wasn't just a target. He was under attack, and the threat was coming from within. As the voices faded, Mark stayed frozen, trying to process what he'd just heard. The direct mention of Leonard, the disdainful tone, and the reference to the glass tower made it clear the conspirators knew their victim well and had inside access to the building. This wasn't just any plot. It was serious, and Mark was the only one aware of it. Back at the front desk, Mark couldn't shake the weight of his discovery. Every word from the garage echoed in his mind. He watched the security cameras, scanning the night's movements. The idea that Leonard, a man so powerful, could be in danger unsettled him. Mark knew this was no coincidence. The conspiracy hadn't started that night. It was something bigger, carefully planned and executed. Meanwhile, Leonard was oblivious. On the top floor of the building, he reviewed confidential contracts with his attorneys, his mind fully absorbed in the multi-million-dollar deals that fueled his empire. Mark thought about this as he monitored the building's comings and goings. Who were the conspirators? Employees? Partners? One thing was clear. In this dangerous game, Leonard was the target. In the days that followed, Mark began connecting the dots. He started noticing details he'd previously overlooked. Odd entry and exit times for certain employees. Faces that didn't belong in the building. Cars parked near the entrance, idling for extended periods. Each small behavior seemed to form part of a larger pattern. Mark felt he was getting closer to something, but wasn't yet sure what. Despite understanding the danger, Mark hesitated. He knew Leonard wasn't the kind of man to trust easily, especially not someone like him, a simple doorman. But there was something in his heart pushing him forward. He knew he couldn't stay silent. He'd never forgive himself if he did. Whether it was fate or just his innate sense of justice, Mark knew he had a choice to make. Leonard carried on with his routine as if nothing was wrong. But Mark could see beyond the surface. He knew the Millionaire, powerful as he was vulnerable in ways he might not even realize. The threats were coming from within, from people who knew every detail of the system he'd built. And Mark was determined. He wouldn't let Leonard discover the danger too late, even if it meant crossing a line he'd never imagined crossing. That night, as rain poured relentlessly, Mark sat at his surveillance desk, watching the cameras with heightened focus. Every movement caught on the lenses seemed like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Somehow, Mark felt he was in that position for a reason. Life has a curious way of choosing its heroes. And that night, Mark decided he was ready for whatever came next. Mark spent that night tossing and turning in bed, wrestling with what to do about what he'd overheard. He was just a doorman after all, not an investigator or someone with the authority to intervene. But the conspirators' voices echoed in his mind, especially the disdainful way they had spoken of Leonard. Mark thought of how the millionaire always greeted him with a polite, albeit brief, nod, even on his busiest days. Something in his conscience told him that if he didn't act, regret would haunt him forever. He agonized for hours. Warning Leonard wouldn't be easy. Why would a man like him believe a doorman? The thought of being dismissed or, worse, ridiculed made Mark hesitate. But he also knew that staying silent would eat away at him. As he stared at the ceiling of his modest room, he remembered a piece of advice his grandfather had once given him. Sometimes, courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. The next morning, Mark arrived at work with a sense of purpose. He knew he'd have to choose his words carefully and, above all, wait for the right moment. For hours, he watched the building's comings and goings, keeping an eye out for Leonard. At last, the millionaire strode through the lobby with his usual confident gait, flanked by two assistants. Mark knew he couldn't approach him then. Not yet, he thought, taking a deep breath. He'd need to wait for a better opportunity. It came sooner than he expected. Late that afternoon, Leonard came down alone to retrieve something from his car. Mark saw him pass the reception desk and knew this might be his only chance. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance," Mark said, his voice hesitant. Leonard stopped, surprised to be addressed so directly. He turned to Mark with a curious expression, but without a hint of condescension. "Is something wrong?" the millionaire asked, as Mark felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Heart pounding, Mark recounted everything he'd heard the night before, describing the conspirators' words and their tone in vivid detail. He emphasized that they had mentioned Leonard's name and something about the codes. Leonard listened in silence, his sharp gaze fixed on Mark as he absorbed every word. There was something about Mark's earnestness that struck a chord. He wasn't the type to waste time on baseless speculation. "Thank you for telling me," Leonard said, his tone brief but serious. Mark could tell this was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Leonard was not a man easily impressed. Accustomed to handling confidential information and navigating subtle betrayals, his first instinct was to question the credibility of Mark's account. A doorman, however observant, could easily misinterpret a situation. But as he listened to the man standing before him, something began to shift. Mark spoke with a conviction that didn't feel rehearsed. His account was detailed, precise, and above all, free from any hint of self-interest. After a few moments of silence, Leonard looked directly at Mark, as if trying to read him. "Do you understand the gravity of what you're saying?" he asked bluntly. Mark nodded, fully aware there was no turning back now. Leonard took a deep breath and, against every instinct urging him to rely solely on his security team, made a bold decision. He knew that, often, the best intelligence came from the most unlikely sources. "All right," he said at last. "I want you to tell me everything, down to the smallest detail." The two of them moved to an empty conference room, away from prying eyes. Mark recounted everything he'd heard in the garage, from the tone of the voices to the direct mention of Leonard's name and LV Tech. He also described the suspicious behavior he'd noticed in the days since. Leonard listened intently, never interrupting, analyzing each word. For Mark, it felt surreal to be sitting next to a millionaire who seemed to command the world. But in that moment, they were just two men trying to understand an imminent threat. Leonard quickly realized Mark was more than just a doorman. His keen attention to detail and the courage to come forward made him a valuable ally. "Why did you do this?" Leonard asked, genuinely curious. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, because it felt like the right thing to do, and because no one deserves to be taken down by something so dirty. Leonard was struck by the simplicity of the response. It wasn't often he encountered people with such clear moral integrity. "I need someone who sees things differently," Leonard said finally. "Someone who isn't tangled in the day-to-day operations, but can notice details others overlook." Mark blinked, surprised. Was the millionaire offering him a role? "If you're willing, I want your help figuring out who's behind this," Leonard continued. "But you need to understand, it could be dangerous." Mark knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "I'm in," he replied without hesitation. Leonard began to explain the broader situation. He'd suspected for months that something was wrong at LV Tech, but had lacked concrete proof. Subtle acts of sabotage, inexplicable delays, and more recently, leaks of sensitive information. Those codes they mentioned could be our internal systems, patents, or even information about future contracts, Leonard said. If that falls into the wrong hands, it could mean the end of the company. Mark realized the problem was far bigger than he'd imagined. And so, an unlikely partnership was formed between the millionaire and the doorman. Leonard entrusted Mark with the task of discreetly observing everything and everyone without raising suspicion. He instructed him to report any unusual behavior, no matter how minor. For Mark, it was an unexpected turn in his otherwise routine life. From an observant doorman, he had become a key player in a dangerous game. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Mark began his new mission with the care of someone treading on thin ice. His position as a doorman gave him a distinct advantage. He could observe everything without arousing suspicion. Every glance, gesture, and word exchanged in the building's corridors was now scrutinized with heightened awareness. Faces that had once been part of his routine now carried layers of potential meaning. Leonard, for his part, stayed hands-off. He understood that Mark needed to operate anonymously for the plan to work. At first, the task felt overwhelming. The building was a hive of constant activity, with people coming and going at all hours. Mark focused on patterns, who stayed late, who avoided eye contact, and who seemed unusually anxious. He also began asking discreet questions of other staff members, careful not to reveal his true intentions. "Have you noticed anyone out of the ordinary around here lately?" he'd ask casually, as if just making conversation. Meanwhile, Leonard tackled his side of the plan. He began reviewing contracts and internal systems, searching for any anomalies. He knew the codes mentioned in the conversation could refer to anything: passwords, patents, or even strategic client data. Methodical and efficient as Leonard was, he recognized that Mark had something he lacked: a perspective from outside the corporate machinery, able to see the whole board without being a player in the game. One night, Mark noticed something peculiar. An employee who always clocked out at 6 p.m. was working late into the night. The man appeared nervous, constantly checking his phone and glancing around. Mark decided to monitor him through the security cameras. At one point, the employee typed something into a tablet and made a phone call. Mark noted the time and reported it to Leonard immediately. Leonard scrutinized Mark's report. "That's one of our software engineers," he explained. He shouldn't have access to the systems that were being tampered with. It was their first concrete lead. Leonard began covertly monitoring the engineer's activities, careful not to raise suspicion. Mark felt a mix of relief and responsibility. The investigation was gaining traction, but the danger felt increasingly tangible. In the days that followed, Mark noticed more suspicious behavior. A normally meticulous administrative assistant was now scatterbrained and visibly tense. A delivery driver who frequently visited the garage started spending an unusual amount of time in the building. Every detail seemed like another piece of the puzzle that Mark and Leonard were piecing together. Mark began to understand that nothing could be dismissed as insignificant in a situation like this. Leonard, for his part, began testing the loyalty of his staff. He planted false information with select employees to see if it would leak. It was a risky strategy, but it began yielding results. Sometimes you have to cast bait to catch the big fish, Leonard told Mark. The doorman, listening intently, saw just how calculated the millionaire could be. Yet, beneath that cold strategy was an unyielding determination to protect what he had built. One evening, Mark decided to take a bold step. He approached one of the suspects under the pretense of helping him carry boxes to his car. During their casual conversation, Mark asked indirect questions about the man's workload and responsibilities. Though the employee tried to maintain composure, Mark noticed a growing nervousness in his responses. It was as if the questions were skirting too close to something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. Impressed by Mark's progress, Leonard shared more details about the investigation. He explained that they were close to identifying the source of unauthorized access to the company's systems. "We're dealing with professionals," Leonard said. "These people know exactly how to cover their tracks." Mark realized the stakes were higher than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just a case of betrayal. It was a sophisticated operation. During a particularly busy afternoon, Mark noticed a recurring visitor to the building. A man in a dark suit always seemed to be in meetings with different people. Curious, Mark followed his movements through the cameras. He discovered that the visitor spent more time in the garage than in any of the offices. When he reported this to Leonard, the name immediately rang a bell. The man was a former external consultant who had been fired months ago. With the pieces starting to fit together, Mark and Leonard decided to ramp up their efforts. Leonard authorized the use of an internal tracking system to monitor suspicious activity in real time. From his strategic vantage point, Mark began cross-referencing what he observed on the cameras with data from the tracking system. What had once seemed like an impossible puzzle was finally revealing its image. The most nerve-wracking moment of the investigation came when Mark realized he was being watched. One of the people he'd been monitoring began asking questions about him. "That doorman seems awfully interested in everything, don't you think?" Mark overheard the remark as he passed by a hallway. It hit him. His involvement was no longer a secret. He wasn't just an investigator now. He was also a target of suspicion. When Leonard learned of this, he immediately increased Mark's security. "You're playing a dangerous game, and now they know it," he warned. Despite the risk, Mark was determined to press on. Something far greater than himself was at stake. Leonard, meanwhile, began to see Mark not just as an ally, but as an indispensable part of the operation. Together, they were defying the odds. With each passing day, the tension mounted. Mark felt they were closing in on something significant, but the pressure was immense. He began to question if he was ready for what lay ahead. Leonard, however, remained resolute. "We're close," he told Mark. "And when we get there, nothing will stop us." Despite his fear, Mark knew he was standing alongside the right man. The moment of answers finally arrived, but not without a cost. After days of meticulous analysis and cross-referencing information, Leonard uncovered a scheme far more intricate than he had imagined. The unauthorized access to LV Tech systems had been traced to a group of high-level employees. For Mark, the discovery brought a mix of relief and shock. "These were people around me every day," the millionaire said, his tone wavering between disbelief and disappointment. Among the culprits were 2 senior engineers and a manager who held a position of direct trust. The betrayal hit Leonard like a physical blow. He had invested in them, believed in their potential, and given them opportunities others might never have had. Mark saw something in Leonard's expression he hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability that even vast wealth couldn't shield. "They know our weaknesses because they helped build them," Leonard murmured, deep in thought. The most surprising revelation, however, was the mastermind behind it all. The investigation exposed that a direct competitor, Kronos Systems, had been financing the operation. The CEO of Kronos, a former business partner of Leonard's, appeared to have orchestrated the sabotage as revenge for a failed deal years earlier. Leonard immediately recalled the man's face. "I should have seen this coming," he admitted, bitterness and clarity mingling in his voice. Mark, on the other hand, was grappling with the complexity of the situation. It was hard for him to understand how people could align themselves so willingly with such a destructive plot. But as he observed the betrayers, he began to notice a pattern: unchecked ambition, professional dissatisfaction, and promises of rewards that eclipsed any moral boundaries. Sometimes people betray because they feel they've never gotten enough, Mark reflected, sharing his thoughts with Leonard. Leonard, however, saw no room for forgiveness. For him, loyalty was non-negotiable, and betrayal was both a personal and professional affront. "They didn't just try to destroy the company. They tried to destroy who I am," he said decisively. Mark listened in silence, recognizing that Leonard's fight wasn't just about safeguarding LV Tech. It was about reclaiming his identity as a leader. Armed with evidence, Leonard convened a private meeting with the company's key executives. He presented the data Mark had helped collect: access logs, intercepted messages, and even security camera footage. The atmosphere in the room was tense, filled with furtive glances and heavy silences. Some faces betrayed the guilt of those already aware they'd been caught, while others showed genuine surprise. "These are the facts," Leonard stated as everyone in the room stared in stunned silence. For Mark, being present at that meeting was eye-opening. He saw how power and fear coexisted in a space where trust was a fragile currency. Leonard refrained from directly accusing anyone during the meeting. Instead, he made it clear that he knew enough to act. "The guilty parties know who they are," he said, ending the meeting on an enigmatic note. Mark realized Leonard wasn't merely addressing the room. He was asserting his dominance over the situation. The most unexpected twist came the following morning, when Mark found an envelope in the garage during his routine rounds. Inside was an anonymous letter and a list of names. "I don't agree with what they're doing," the letter read. The author, evidently someone within the scheme, was attempting to save themselves. Mark delivered the envelope directly to Leonard, who instantly recognized the names. It was the final confirmation they had been waiting for. While Leonard felt some relief at having more pieces of the puzzle, the weight of responsibility bore down on him. He knew he had to act swiftly before the situation spiraled out of control. For Mark, the letter served as a reminder that even in betrayal, there were layers of conscience. "Not everyone's the same," he remarked, watching Leonard process the new information. Leonard gave a slight nod in agreement, though his mind was already racing. It was then that Leonard decided to turn the tables. He would use the conspirators' own tactics against them. A plan began to take shape, involving the creation of a fake information leak to lure the culprits out into the open. Mark, now an integral part of the strategy, would play a critical role. "We're close to the end," Leonard said with determination. Mark, though exhausted, knew the hardest part was still ahead. The relationship between Mark and Leonard had evolved into a partnership few would have anticipated. The millionaire now saw the doorman as more than an ally. Mark had become a kind of confidant. And though neither man said it aloud, both understood that this experience would change them forever. What they had learned was simple yet profound. A person's value isn't defined by their position, but by what they're willing to do when the stakes are highest. Leonard knew the best defense was a well-planned offense. Armed with the necessary information, he and Mark devised a bold plan to expose the traitors. The idea was to create a fake data leak, simulating the transfer of a valuable project to a fictitious server. Any attempt to access the content would immediately reveal the culprits. Mark was impressed by Leonard's strategic mind. It was like watching a chess master move pieces across a board with precision. Preparations began immediately. Leonard enlisted a trusted IT team to create the decoy environment, while Mark continued to observe activity around the building. The goal was to avoid raising suspicion, maintaining as much normalcy as possible. Mark roamed the building as he always did, but now with heightened vigilance. He knew the traitors were there and that at any moment, they might take the bait. Tension mounted when one of the suspects began showing signs of nervousness. Mark watched him pacing in and out of a conference room, as if wrestling with a decision. It was exactly the type of behavior Leonard had anticipated. "We're close," Leonard said, studying the reports Mark had brought him. He knew the plan's success hinged on his patience. The trap had to be flawless. On the night the fake data leak went live, Mark monitored the cameras with unblinking focus. The system logged every access attempt, and Leonard had ensured that any activity would be traced instantly. It didn't take long for the first suspect to bite. The access was flagged, and the logs revealed that the employee had used an external device to copy the data. Mark alerted Leonard immediately, who simply nodded, as if he had expected it. Shortly after, 2 more access attempts were recorded. One came from the office of a senior engineer Mark had been watching closely. The other originated from a laptop belonging to a consultant who had no business being in the building at that hour. "They're desperate," Leonard said, his tone a mix of satisfaction and seriousness. The trap was working, and every step the traitors took was another victory. Meanwhile, Mark held his position, vigilant for any movements throughout the building. He knew the traitors, once exposed, might try to flee or destroy evidence. Leonard, for his part, was prepared to act quickly. He had assembled a team of lawyers and security experts to ensure no critical information slipped through their grasp. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, and Mark felt the weight of being at its center. The following morning brought the climax of their efforts. Leonard called an emergency meeting with the company's top executives. He withheld specifics at first, but his tone made it clear something significant was about to be revealed. Mark, stationed discreetly at the reception desk, watched the suspects enter the conference room with tense expressions. Leonard, by contrast, exuded a calm that was almost unsettling, like a man about to topple a house of cards with a single move. During the meeting, Leonard methodically explained the fake data leak and how it had been designed to lure out the guilty parties and gather undeniable evidence. As he spoke, Mark monitored the suspects' reactions through the cameras. One began visibly sweating. Another avoided making eye contact with Leonard altogether. The truth was unraveling before everyone's eyes. At the conclusion of the meeting, Leonard presented the access logs. "These records leave no doubt," he said, his gaze fixed on the guilty individuals. "You didn't just betray this company. You betrayed the trust one placed in you." The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, Mark watched with a mix of relief and triumph. The trap had worked flawlessly. With the traitors exposed, Leonard wasted no time enacting consequences. Contracts were terminated, and legal action was initiated. For Mark, the moment marked the culmination of weeks of tension and vigilance. He realized that, despite being just a doorman, he had played an essential role in protecting something far greater. Leonard, in turn, looked at Mark with a respect few could earn. Both knew there was still work to be done, but the worst was behind them. The tension in the building was palpable. After Leonard revealed the suspicious access logs during the meeting, the traitors realized they had been caught. One of the engineers tried to argue, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding, but Leonard remained steadfast. "The records don't lie," he said, locking eyes with the man. Mark, watching the scene unfold through the camera feed, knew this was a decisive moment. The truth was finally out in the open. Leonard didn't hold back. He detailed how the trap had been set and how the suspects had walked right into it. With each sentence, the guilty parties grew paler. One of them attempted to stand and leave the room, only to be stopped by the security team Leonard had discreetly called in. "You're not going anywhere," Leonard declared, his authority leaving no room for argument. Mark felt a surge of both relief and admiration at those words. The confrontation reached its peak when Leonard presented a comprehensive dossier outlining each suspect's involvement. Names, timestamps, emails, and file transfers were meticulously documented. "You sold your soul for a handful of cash," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. Watching from afar, Mark imagined the weight of being in that room. It was impossible not to feel the gravity of the moment. It marked the end of a cycle of betrayal. One of the culprits, visibly shaken, began to confess. He admitted to being approached by the competitor, Chronos Systems, and claimed the offers were too tempting to resist. "They knew everything about the company about you," he said, directing his words to Leonard. "I thought we'd never get caught." Leonard listened in silence, letting the weight of the confession hang over the room. Mark knew this was the final blow. There was nowhere left for the traitors to hide. The most shocking revelation, however, came when the trusted manager, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. He admitted to being the initial link between Chronos and the others. "I never wanted it to go this far," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. Leonard didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the man, as if dissecting every word. To Mark, it was remarkable how Leonard maintained such composed control. There was no shouting, just a quiet, commanding presence. After hearing everything, Leonard brought the confrontation to a definitive close. "Betrayal is a poison that destroys from the inside out," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "But you made an even greater mistake. You underestimated my ability to fight for what's mine." The traitors had no response. Security was instructed to escort them out, while Leonard was already strategizing his next moves. Watching it all unfold, Mark felt that Leonard had emerged victorious, but not without scars. Before the culprits left the room, Leonard did something unexpected. He approached the manager and said quietly, "You were someone I trusted. That's the greatest pain you've caused me." His tone carried no anger, only a deep sadness that seemed to echo in the room. Watching the scene, Mark realized that beneath Leonard's commanding exterior lay a profoundly human side. It was a lesson he would never forget. The confrontation ended with a heavy but resolute atmosphere. Leonard knew the battle wasn't entirely over. There were legal proceedings to handle and damages to repair. Yet, he felt a renewed sense of control. Mark, for his part, saw a transformation in the Millionaire. Leonard appeared more grounded, more aware of the fragility of the relationships he had built. Mark wondered if this experience would change him forever. In the days that followed, the company underwent significant reorganization. Leonard implemented sweeping measures to strengthen security and rebuild internal trust. Mark resumed his post, but with a newfound sense of purpose. He understood now that he had played a pivotal role in saving the company. More importantly, he had learned that even the most modest positions could have a profound impact. Leonard acknowledged this in his own quiet way. Though he didn't express it outright, Mark knew his contributions were deeply valued. The confrontation marked the end of a turbulent chapter, but also the beginning of something new. Leonard had faced a threat that could have destroyed everything he had built, but emerged stronger. Mark, too, had discovered that true power isn't in titles or wealth. It lies in the ability to act when it matters most. Together, they had overcome the challenge, and the path ahead now seemed clearer. Their story, however, was far from over. The morning started like any other, but Mark felt something different in the air. There was an unusual stillness in the building, as though recent events had left a void, waiting to be filled. Though Mark resumed his duties at the reception desk, he knew things would never return to how they once were. He had become part of a larger story, and while he didn't expect recognition, a part of him yearned for closure. Leonard seemed to share that need. Around noon, Leonard descended from the top floor, but this time, without his usual entourage of assistants and security. He looked less imposing but more human, carrying an air of purpose. "Mark, do you have a minute?" he asked, dropping his usual formality. Surprised, Mark nodded and followed him to a small meeting room near the lobby. During the brief walk, he felt the weight of the moment, as though he was about to cross an invisible threshold. Inside the room, Leonard closed the door and turned to face Mark. What you did, Mark, was more than some trained professionals could have managed. He began, his tone serious but sincere. You didn't just help save my company. You reminded me of things I'd forgotten. The importance of watching, listening, and trusting. Mark, unaccustomed to such praise, remained silent, his mind racing. I've always believed talent can come from unexpected places. You've proven that. Leonard pulled an envelope from his briefcase and handed it to Mark. Inside was an official proposal, a promotion to a position on LV Tech's internal security team. I want you to leave the reception desk and take on a role where your skills can truly shine, Leonard explained. You'll be responsible for monitoring sensitive operations and identifying potential threats, something you've already shown to be your specialty. Mark read through the papers carefully, his heart pounding. The offer was more than he had ever dreamed. The position came with a significant pay raise, access to benefits he had never imagined, and exclusive corporate security training. Mark was stunned. Mr. Vance, I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like this, he said hesitantly. Leonard shook his head, smiling with a mix of encouragement and conviction. Mark, you've already proven you're more than qualified. This is the kind of opportunity that isn't about degrees, it's about character. And you have that in spades. After a moment of silence, Mark took a deep breath. He knew accepting the offer meant stepping out of his comfort zone, but he also knew he couldn't turn it down. I accept, he said, his voice a mixture of emotion and determination. Leonard shook his hand firmly, sealing the deal. You won't regret it, the millionaire assured him. For the first time, Mark felt someone truly believed in his potential. It was a transformative moment. In the days that followed, Mark began transitioning into his new role. He was introduced to the internal security team, a group of seasoned professionals. While he initially felt out of place, his sharp attention to detail quickly stood out. He was like a rookie who already understood the game better than many veterans. Leonard observed his progress from afar, confident that Mark would not only adapt but thrive. He has instincts you can't teach, Leonard remarked to a director. The promotion also brought changes to Mark's personal life. With his new salary, he was able to help his mother pay off long-standing debts, a burden they had carried for years. He even started planning a family trip, something that had always seemed like a distant dream. Yet for Mark, the greatest reward was the sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just a doorman. He was someone who had earned his place in a world that once seemed out of reach. In a symbolic gesture, Leonard shared Mark's story during a company-wide meeting. He wanted everyone to know how the doorman who had watched over the building every day had played a critical role in saving LV Tech. A person's value isn't in their title, but in what they do when given the opportunity, Leonard said, concluding his speech. Listening to those words, Mark felt a mix of pride and humility. Months later, Mark ran into Leonard in the lobby, a rare occurrence. The millionaire smiled and said, You know, Mark, when I think about everything that happened, I realize fate has a funny way of choosing its heroes. Mark, returning the smile, replied, Sometimes, fate just needs someone willing to listen. They both laughed, fully aware that their improbable story had changed their lives forever. Mark was no longer just an employee. He was at last part of something greater. The story of Mark and Leonard is more than a tale of success or perseverance. It's a profound lesson about the true value of human connections. It teaches us that, no matter where we are in life, there's always something to learn, and sometimes the hero we need comes from the most unexpected places. Mark showed us that the courage to act and the determination to do what's right can open doors that once seemed unreachable. Leonard, on the other hand, learned that true power doesn't lie solely in numbers or strategies, but in the people who underpin every achievement. He realized that real wealth isn't measured in figures, but in trust, integrity, and the positive impact we create around us. His journey with Mark revealed that success becomes far more meaningful when shared and built on a foundation of mutual respect and appreciation. This story also reminds us of the value of humility. Even when recognized, Mark stayed true to his simple and genuine nature. He demonstrated that no matter how big the stage, authenticity is what truly sets us apart. Leonard, in turn, discovered that even those in leadership roles have something to learn. His transformation from a distant leader to someone more in tune with his team is a powerful example of how empathy can strengthen any relationship. Another key takeaway from this story is the significance of small choices. Mark could have ignored that conversation in the garage. Leonard could have dismissed Mark's report as insignificant. But both chose to act, and those decisions, seemingly small at the time, created a domino effect that changed everything. It's a reminder that even the smallest gestures can have extraordinary outcomes. There's also a lesson about opportunities and meritocracy. Leonard saw a talent in Mark that many would have overlooked and chose to invest in him, proving that great achievements don't always hinge on degrees or titles, but on courage, character, and action. This decision to value someone on the sidelines not only redefined Mark's life, but also reshaped the culture at LV Tech, showing that investing in people is any leader's greatest asset. Finally, this story challenges us to reconsider how we view others. How often do we judge someone by their position or appearance, without considering what they're truly capable of? To many, Mark was just a doorman, but to Leonard, he became an indispensable ally. This lesson invites us to see the world with more empathy and curiosity, because we never know who might make a difference in our lives. So now I ask you, what have you learned from this story? Have you ever experienced a moment where an unexpected decision changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring lessons like this one. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any updates. And remember, true wealth lies in the connections we make and the lessons we learn along the way. Before you go, check out the next video on your screen. I'm sure it will move you just as deeply and help you see new possibilities. Let's continue transforming stories into lessons and inspiration. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then,